once again, Martin Catherall and myself are bringing this session to you, where we're lucky to be being presented by Matt Gordon, who's going to be talking to us about crushing a cloud migration, moving mountains while migrating data. Before we get into that, for anybody who's new to this virtual session, we try and keep it as close to a in-person session as we can. If you do have any questions throughout the session, raise your hand, put it in the chat window, and we'll be able to get those questions answered as you need, like you would in a in-person event. Don't be afraid to ask questions. It's the best way to get the answers and learn from this session. For those of you who don't know, we do have Data Platform Community Summit, or hang on, Data Community Pass Summit coming up. I think I got that correct. That if you haven't registered, it's in November. Bear with me a second, and let's just go. Okay, so it's in November, November 8 to 12. I myself will be presenting. Martin is presenting. Matt is also presenting, not on what this topic is. If you haven't already registered, make sure you go to the Past Data Community Summit webpage, register. It's 100% free, unless you want to do a pre-con, which I forget the price on those, but they are relatively cheap for you to go along for a full day's training, and there's plenty to choose from. So with that, we'll hand over to Matt, and he can take us through today's session.
All right, let's get my screen shared here. Sometimes Teams will let me do this the way I want it to. Hopefully you're seeing me starting a slideshow here.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So I'll underscore what you were saying. The way Teams comes up on mine, I can't see the chat while I do this, other than kind of pausing the talk and changing one thing. So definitely raise your hand. I'm okay if people want to unmute too. Like you said, the closer this feels to an in-person thing, I think the more fun it is for all of us, and the more we get out of it probably as well. Yeah, so this is the talk we're here for. I'll note, so I was in consulting for years, and you'll note from my title there that I'm not now. And so I do want to kind of set a couple of ground rules up front here. Number one, this talk really comes from my consulting background and also some stuff we're doing now, because part of the reason that I took the position I'm in about this time last year is because Rev.io was positioned to do a cloud migration within the next year or two. And it was kind of exciting to me to be able to put a team together and kind of be in charge of that. But that leads me to the second point. Is I'm not a consultant now. I'm not here to sell you anything. There aren't going to be slides in here that you should use company XYZ to do this because I work there. That said, if something comes out of this and you're like, oh, I really feel like we need consulting help to do this, there are plenty of folks to ask here. But yeah, I'm not going to try to sell you anything. I'm just going to go over lessons I've learned, tools we've used, and we'll kind of chat about what makes a cloud migration work well and what makes them not work at all, and end in tears. These are all the ways to find me online. I'm SQL at Speed, Twitter, LinkedIn, blog, GitHub, all that stuff. Feel free to reach out. This talk is a little under a year old, but obviously the last year and a half being what it's been, it's not a session I've delivered over and over and over again. So if there's any feedback, structure-wise, topic-wise, any of that stuff, feel free to send that to me any of these ways. The joke I usually use is, if you think it was great, tweet about it. And if you think it was terrible, email me and don't tell anybody else. But honestly, whatever venue you wish to use to give me feedback on this talk is totally fine. I always want it to be better the next time. So hopefully everybody learns something, and hopefully I learn something on how to improve this as well. This is stuff about me. The only really interesting thing here is this last line. So yeah, I'm in kind of the middle of the US, and I run what used to be called Lexington Pass, and obviously with Pass being more or less no more, I run our user group here. And obviously as challenging as this has been on so many fronts for everybody, I wanted to take a second to thank everybody for being here and remind you how helpful it can be to stay plugged into groups like this. Getting involved in data community stuff, no lie, has changed my life. And it sure looks different now, but there's still, I always say the worst case, like if you attend a user group or a conference or something like that, the worst thing that can happen usually is that you've learned something you didn't know. The best thing is, even now, maybe you've made a networking connection or something like that with somebody who is going to be a friend of yours, or kind of points you towards the next job, or points you down a path that you didn't know you were headed down, but can be very helpful. So thanks for being here now. Stick with stuff like this. And if we have people that aren't local to this group, find one where you are. Microsoft has kind of stepped into the gap of what Pass left. And I don't have the URL in front of me, but maybe somebody can throw it in chat. The Azure data community, they've given all of our groups lots of free tools to use, and a very helpful website where you can put in where you are or where you're moving to, and you can find a group that's close to you. So thanks for being here. As I mentioned, I'm SQL at Speed everywhere online, and I use this next slide as an excuse to both remind you of that, but also point out the only thing I like to talk about more than data and AI stuff is car racing. So if the data stuff that I'm going to talk about after this isn't that interesting to you, but motor racing is, I'm always happy to chat about that. I love it. And these are some of the cars that I get to drive. So lots and lots of fun there. But we're not here to learn any more about me, right? We're here to learn about this. So like I said, this session comes from lessons learned on projects big and small that I've been on, some very successful, some not successful at all. And this first part of the talk, we're gonna kind of lay the groundwork, because I would say the one common element that every unsuccessful project that I was a part of had was this part didn't happen. So we would show up as consulting group XYZ, and they'd be like, okay, we're migrating this many databases or this much data or whatever, and we're going to put it in Azure in this thing, and that's just what we're doing, and that's all you need to know. Those almost never work. You need to understand what the motivation is, because the back end of this talk is mostly talking about where can we migrate things to, what are the tools we can use to get there, how do we assess how ready our database is for that kind of stuff. If you haven't done this part, you're going to make bad choices in that part, because sometimes what you would consider the technically better solution doesn't fit right, or doesn't meet a goal that the executive sponsor has. So let's talk about some of the motivations I've seen. And like I said, let's make this as interactive as we can. If you feel like I've left one or more out, or want to chat more about one of the ones that I mentioned, feel free. So the first one seems to be the most common, probably because Microsoft's and Amazon's marketing budget's pretty substantial. And this is the sales pitch often. And it's, well, you go to the cloud, it's going to save you a bunch of money. So it can, but that's by no means guaranteed. And this is the first of a list of probably 6 of these. Like I said, it's the most common, so we'll start here. If your boss, manager, team lead, executive, CTO, whatever, comes to you and says, we need to move to the cloud to save money, and you're going to hear me say this phrase over and over again for the next 50 minutes or so. You need to set expectations with them on what that means, because where I've often heard this paired up with, well, we're going to lift and shift everything to the cloud and we're going to save money. And oftentimes that's a fairly complicated set of VMs and things like that on-prem. Maybe there's availability groups and other technologies like that mixed in, and that is just all magically going to go to the cloud and somehow cost less. I've seen that happen with clients where the data center was maybe on very expensive land or in a very large city, but most of the time it's going to cost you more to run the same physical environment in the cloud. Not every single time, but most of the time. So if saving money is the goal, the expectation I think you should set, and you're probably gonna have to explain what this means, and in a few slides we'll go over this here, you're gonna wanna suggest a lot of the platform as a service offerings, because that for me has always been kind of where the money savings comes in. Not that they're inexpensive, but you can, if you do it right and you combine a lot of things there, a lot of the reason you may be lifting and shifting your on-prem environment, high availability, things like that, you want to maintain all that, we can achieve in Azure SQL in one of the service tiers somewhere. And we'll talk later in depth about what that means and what kinds of on-prem environments we can have in the cloud without actually having to manage all the moving parts. But don't make the mistake of responding to that manager who said, well, I've laid the plan out, we're moving 100 VMs exactly as they are and we're going to save a bunch of money. Have that conversation early, because it's unlikely that that's the case. We'll talk later about some money saving tips around a lot of VMs and ways you can kind of shave costs there. But this is kind of the first ground rule that I like to set. The platform as a service stuff is the most bang for the buck for me most of the time. So the second one, and this is, some of these may not sound fun, but these are all things that I've seen and they do at some level make sense. So maybe there's a management goal, corporate goal, something like that, where it's, well, we have 5 data centers spread across 3 nations and we need to consolidate that to 2. Or we're getting out of the data center business, in the next year, and we need to close all of these and put them in the cloud somewhere because contracts are running out, leases are up, something like that. Sometimes this can go hand in hand with money saving, but my experience has been more that it's it's a lot of like a corporate modernization push. It's like, well, we want to be able to tell our customers we're cloud native or cloud focused or whatever the buzzword is that you want to use. But for people in teams like us, this means we're getting out of all this. We're getting out of kind of where we're comfortable. We need to head to the cloud to do that. A lot of times there's an element of time here as well. So it could be that not only is this happening, but we have 6 months to do it or something like that. And that's where I say, and you'll hear me say this over and over again for the next few slides, if the motivation is this and there's that time goal, like you have 6 months to get everything out, then again, the most technically ideal solution that you can think of may not be the best fit, because it may not get you out of there in the time that you need to meet. So where you're setting expectations for everybody else, you yourself have to be flexible as well, because you don't want to be the person holding up what could have been a successful project, because the hill you've chosen to die on is it should be architected just like this and no other way, and none of the options in the cloud are just right except for this one, and your project misses its deadline, your discipline, like you don't want to be in that spot. So that is a second reason. A third one, and people usually laugh when I say this, but it's true, is, and these are often less projects than like proofs of concept, things like that, but sometimes it is a project, Somebody's boss has come to them and said, listen, my bonus goal or our team bonus goal or our team's goal is you have to put data in the cloud somehow. Like you're ticking that box that you've moved a database to Azure. Nobody cares where. It's just you sign the form. Yep. Okay. I've moved this from on-prem to Azure, and now I get $1,000, and that's a real story. This is legitimate. It may seem silly. It may seem not particularly well thought out. It may be both of those things, but it is a thing. So sometimes, then that's all you're trying to do, right? You're not trying to show off and put something complex out there. You're just trying to get a database up in Azure so you can go to your boss and say, listen, this VM is in Azure, or this Azure SQL thing is obviously in Azure. I met my goal. Where's my bonus? Kind of thing. So, this is another one where speed is probably helpful to us over like technical perfection. A couple other ones. As good as Microsoft is at marketing a lot of cloud stuff, sometimes a little too good. This one I feel like is something that's flown under the radar for a while, and that's if you're supporting actually either Windows Server 2008 and or SQL Server 2008 setups, you can get up to 3 years of extended support on those simply by moving them up to Azure. Where I've seen this a lot is clients in healthcare and things like that, finance to a certain extent, where they're very risk averse. And a lot of times it's something where, a vendor that sold them a particular piece of software that's generally some sort of critical bit. The vendor doesn't exist, went out of business, got bought out, whatever. But the last version certified for their use is probably running on SQL Server 2008, and your risk management group won't let you upgrade. And you can give them all the good technical reasons why you should, but they may not let you. So if you're trying to give yourself kind of as much runway and as much safety to keep something that old running for a long time, moving it to Azure makes sense, because Microsoft definitely throws you a bone there and says, listen, we'll support this for a lot longer if you're paying money to us each month to do it, basically. So it's not out of the kindness of their heart, but it is something I've seen help customers who were stuck in that boat, that just you're wedded to this version. There's nothing you can do. There's no argument that you can win. But again, you still want to be running that in kind of as safe a manner as you possibly can. The last point here kind of goes in tandem with the first one. And it goes back to what I started saying kind of right up top is I have been in meetings where we were kicking off a migration project, some small, some enterprise-wide. And the kickoff of the meeting is the goal of this project is to lift and shift everything we have on-prem to the cloud, and that's what we're going to do. And as the sub-bullet says here, technology-wise, that is very often not the right choice. It is generally something put together by, I would say, somebody, maybe they are technical, but not kind of current. Maybe they used to be technical and very much aren't, but they've decided that is kind of the easiest way to do this, absent, I would say, current information and consulting with the teams they have who probably know a better way, especially if you're attending events like this. And we've spent years talking about the different ways to migrate things and the different places you can land this stuff. That manager or executive probably isn't plugged into this stuff. And they've convinced everybody that they have a big pile of money to move everything to the cloud exactly the way that they have it now. And this is a good time to pick a fight. If you're the one that's going to be either tasked with leading that or tasked with working on it, really have that deep dive and go through these other points that we've talked about. Like, what are we doing here? Are we trying to save money? Are we trying to get out of buildings that we need to be out of? and let that guide every decision that happens afterwards. Any questions or comments about that? Okay.
Nothing in the chat, Matt.
Okay. All right. So this kind of leads us to the next thing. So we spent that first group of slides talking about, in general, who's tasked us with this, right? Who the executive sponsor might be, who's leading the effort, whose idea it was, whatever form that takes. Now we need to talk about the people that stand in our way. And every project I've ever been on, these people exist. So let's go through some of the examples I've seen and maybe some ways that we can either kind of bring them over to our side or work around them. So this first one is first for a reason. Management support is essential. If it's the data team lead or the lead DBA or something like that, who, this effort is kind of wholly inspired and owned by them, that you're generally, I wouldn't say doomed to failure, but it's a steep mountain to climb from there. Projects like this take money and they need leadership across the org. And these next few points, we'll talk about why that is. A lot of times this is handed to the database team, whatever that's called, and whatever kind of people make that up. And it's like, hey, migrate our databases to Azure. It's so much more than that, because those databases probably support apps. And to these next, really, I would say 4 to 5 points, that this has an impact across your operations. It's not just the data people. Like if I go dump a database out at Azure somewhere, unless that was a bonus goal of mine, I really haven't achieved anything just by moving that. Like it's in a different place, but if it's supporting somebody's work, and that work is any more complicated than connecting directly to the database to look at something, I've more likely broken something than actually improved something. So management support is essential, and it's important to identify who supports it and who doesn't. And that's where the rest of these slides come from, because it's, just because it's one person's idea doesn't mean that other teams and other parts of leadership share those priorities and goals as well. Second point here, bring your operations team in as early as you possibly can. And I say operations here because that's kind of the most common naming that I've seen. But they may be called networking, they may be called IT, something like that. But whoever does your networking, your security, your storage, kind of that enterprise architecture role, bring them in early. Most of the projects I've seen where it didn't end in disaster, but we really fell short of the goals we had, it's because this team wasn't brought in early enough. And that often goes back to that first point, that their leadership may be different and they have other goals tied to bonuses and raises and who knows what else, and they're not too bought in a cloud migration, or they are, but they're not resourced for it. So get your operations people bought in. Make sure that the leadership that's tasked you with this understands how important that is, and that they are a critical piece of this. Because if you're starting from scratch and you don't have Azure authentication set up and you don't have any sort of a networking path out to the cloud, you're going to need them really before the data team can do much of anything other than play around. So get them brought in, get them bought in, and this is all going to go much easier. Trust me. Third thing, and this isn't true for all of them, but I've been in a couple migrations where we weren't migrating like commercial off-the-shelf stuff. We were migrating a lot of homegrown, home-built apps. Where applicable, if the development team still exists and enough of the folks still work there and the app is relatively recent, you're going to want to bring them not necessarily in on the ground floor, but in pretty early, because there may be things that are peculiar to that app. It's app servers, it's web servers, it's database structures, connections, who knows what, where they're gonna be able to kind of save you some time and say, well, it's set up like this for this reason. We know that's not really conducive to the cloud, but here's why we did it. And some of those are going to need some special treatment to get migrated right. And sometimes the answer is that they can't. I can think of things where we were trying to migrate things that were production floor type things. And you're talking about an old PC running like Windows 7 or something like that with SQL Server on it. SQL Server supports, a modestly sized database that runs some piece of equipment. That's its only job. And sometimes that stuff just can't be moved. And the quicker you can identify what that is, again, going back to setting expectations and goals and things like that, it's going to also help the project look more successful if you identify those early instead of getting to the last status call and saying, well, here's the 10 we found out we can't move at all because they're old or there's something unique or strange about them. So this is not the only three groups that can stand in our way. There's more. The security group, absolutely critical. Now the hope is that your security and networking and storage folks maybe all have the same leadership. That leadership is on board with this, and this is going to go the best that it possibly can for you. But a lot of places that I've worked or clients I've gone into, these were spread across different groups. Like general IT might do the networking piece, but InfoSec was its own group with its own leadership. And maybe they reported all to the same CTO and maybe they didn't. But bring them in early because and I won't say troublesome because the security group is supposed to stand in the way of things that are dangerous, right? They can bring your project to a stop. And this is true for companies large and small. Oftentimes that group has enough power to say, we are uncomfortable with how this is being done, and until it's done the way we want, you stop. And that's a quick way for a project to die off. So again, make sure that they're bought in and that they understand what you're trying to do. So you need to understand what your end game is as well. So we're going to spend the rest of this talk really after the next couple of slides talking about all the technical stuff. Make sure you kind of have the end game mapped out and you can tell them like, well, here's our ultimate goal. Here's where we're going to end up. And then you tell us the safe way to get there. Odds are they're going to need to work closely with whatever your networking team is called. So again, just like I said, general operations, sometimes all of these groups are part of that, sometimes not. If there's a separate networking team and you don't have anything out in Azure, like this is kind of the first beachhead to get things out there, they need to be brought in as early as you possibly can. And you may not necessarily need to know the whole end game, but they need to understand kind of what your ultimate goal is. And odds are they're going to work hand in hand with you throughout the project as well, because it's not necessarily as simple as, well, we've set up an express route VPN to Azure, and now the networking people can go off and do their own stuff. Networking in Azure is really important. And if your team is not well versed enough in that, or strong enough, or given the ability to manage that, you're going to need to rely on this team to make the project successful. And like I said, odds are the interface with the security group is going to be more them than even a data team. So bring them in, make sure you've got a resource or resources from there and that they understand what you're after. So the last one, and this is something I've seen more than I would have expected, is that basically where the DBA team is uncomfortable in the cloud. They may have said, well, when I connect to an Azure SQL database and management studio, it doesn't look right. I can't find agent. And it looks strange to me. And I've been running SQL Server on-prem 15 years and just Azure isn't for me. This can happen. And if the manager, let's say it's kind of like a team lead situation, the team's been together for a long time and perhaps have gotten a bit stale skill-wise, or just, human nature is kind of, you don't want to rock the boat, right? So they may just want to keep doing things the way they've always done it. If their team lead is inclined that way as well, the project can kind of grind itself to a halt because these are people that are going to have to execute parts of this. And so you want them bought in. Where I've had success making that happen, even with teams that kind of said those things I just said, those are largely direct quotes from folks that I won't name. there's so much free training available. Microsoft has a ground to cloud workshop that can be self-started, but if you have somebody in kind of a leadership role or who knows this stuff pretty well, it's pretty easy to teach in like a day or two, and you're going to have people building all this stuff that odds are you're going to build out in Azure in the weeks and months afterwards. So Microsoft's got tons of free resources. Obviously, there's things like Pass Summit this year, which is free, DPS, which just happened, which was free except for precons. Though there's been rarely anything good about what's happened in our world over the last 18 months. Maybe one slightly positive thing is there's so much free content out there that it's a lot easier to bring a team along, because you don't have to say, well, I need to send the whole team to a 5-day on-site class somewhere. Instead, you can point them to all these free resources and get that upskilling moving. So just to kind of summarize this part before we get to the nerd stuff, executing a migration as an outside consultant takes similar but slightly different skills to if you're leading it as a team lead or something like that. Knowing the politics of the organization are essential. Just because the executive sponsor has the title of CTO or whatever, they may not be the person who actually calls the shots. It may be somebody in a different part of the org who people have more confidence in than the person who the org chart says is in charge. And understanding that and kind of building relationships with everybody to get to that level of information is really important. And I would say that even starts from sales. The ones that I've had that went really well, our salespeople built those bonds during the sales process, and were able to kind of give us like a briefing that it wasn't that formal, but it's basically, listen, here are the people, here are the titles, but here's who actually makes things go over there. So it's important to know that. As I've mentioned a couple times, it's important to understand that not everybody's priorities, interests, and goals are the same. And so all the groups we've just talked about that might be able to, that might stand in our way if we don't bring them in early, they may not be resourced for this. They may not have budget for this. They may not have time for it. So understand that and know, kind of understand the subtle ways to bring them along and make all that stuff go is going to be really important. And that kind of brings us to this: learn where the centers of power are. It's never as simple as looking at an org chart and saying, these 4 people are in charge and they can make all these other people do things. There's always somebody that may not be on that org chart or maybe in a place that wouldn't indicate they have a lot of authority, but they have a lot of respect and power. And those are the people you're going to want to be your friends to kind of get this steered right. If you're inside, it's a little different. Odds are you have that knowledge of the politics already because you've worked there for some time. Still good to know, but it's less of a concern. It's not a prep thing. You're just, going in kind of who makes things do what. Understand, regardless whether you're, DBA intern to lead to who knows what. Don't be shy about working up and down the org chart to get the resources that you need to make this go. People, this is a good time to kind of expand. I hate the term soft skills, but it's kind of appropriate here. It's a good time to exercise those soft skills and try to, maybe you don't have authority over these folks, but try to lead them. That's projects like this with strong leadership throughout the teams are more successful than the ones where everybody's kind of working in their own little hole. Any questions, comments?
Matt, we do have a couple of questions.
Cool.
So first question, have you actually used the TCO calculator as a justification for a migration to Azure?
Yes. Yeah, so I could probably do a whole session, not only on the Azure cost calculator, but yeah, things like that where you're going in the kind of a deep dive with like a CTO or a CFO or who knows what. But yeah, that's why understanding that goal is so important, because if the goal is to save money, you can have some pretty direct conversations early on say the path you're going down will not save you money here, and here's what that means. Here's what that actually looks like.
Okay, so the second question is Azure Active Directory mandatory, even just with AD Connect before any DB migration?
That's a complicated question. I would recommend it, but it really depends, again, on what the databases are used for. So you can certainly put a lot of stuff out in Azure, use SQL Auth to get to it, and if it's a lot of direct connects, whether it's people or data viz tools or something like that, you could probably get away with that and be just fine. But if you're moving apps, and this is where the networking and to a certain extent the security people come in handy, odds are they're going to want to extend your authentication footprint out there so they can manage it enterprise wide. And it's not like, well, we let the data people have their little playground out in Azure, but we don't manage that, and it's all SQL Auth. That's not, you're eventually going to get to a point where that's unwieldy and not great. So I wouldn't say it's required, but it's recommended if you're doing anything more than where I talked about, like you're just trying to move a database to get a bonus. If you're trying to do this at any sort of enterprisey scale, then yeah, you're going to want to look hard at that, and you're going to want to bring in the groups that do that.
Okay, and third question before continuing. So how would you decide between using a vendor-supported COTS SaaS versus a DIY for the COTS application by doing things such as move to PaaS for data, excuse me, database, and IaaS for VMs?
So the classic answer, right? It depends. But really, every organization where I've tried to do this at an enterprise scale had a blend of both of those. What was interesting to me is oftentimes when we would start the evaluation process, and it's like, all right, here's the 2 data centers they have to be out of in a year. Let's run the map tool or something like that. Let's get every server. Let's understand every database that's on it and what it's for. You'll bump into kind of a weird mix of stuff. And it's like, all right, well, this is their old CRM tool that they're moving out of. And then this is some current thing that manages something for them. And then this was kind of a do-it-yourself tool that they built to do this one thing, and they built it 5 years ago, but it still works, and they don't want to mess with it. There's almost always going to be that blend. And depending on the industry you're in and what those apps do, it's difficult to give kind of a firm answer and say like, well, yeah, you should always pay a vendor and have it done right. Because sometimes there are no vendors that do exactly what you want, and you have a team that can do it and do it well. But when a migration is on your radar screen, and that's where it's not necessarily reaching out to that dev team as part of the migration process. It's more, listen, 12 months from now, we're going to be out in Azure. So let's make sure we're forward thinking and we're not building something that has things in it that's going to make that move to Azure difficult or not possible. But yeah, I would struggle to give an answer that's correct for every situation. But I think it is good to understand there's almost always that blend of apps. And that's something I don't really have a slide for it, but it's a good point to make that when you're analyzing stuff and trying to figure out like what is going to be migrated and what its roles are and all that, another way to make these projects really successful is to migrate less stuff. And I can think back to somewhere, you look at something and there's 5 servers that, like I said, they support the CRM tool they've used for 5 years, but that tool is going away in 6 months. We didn't migrate any of that. And it, not only does it save money, it saves time, it saves hassle. So yeah, sometimes you're moving away from a DIY tool to, an off-the-shelf piece of software, and sometimes you're going that other way, but you're almost always going to encounter a mix of all of that.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
All right. Well, let's get back into it. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork and understand hopefully more about what makes these projects successful and what doesn't, let's get into the nerd stuff. So I always like to start with this slide. I know there's a version of this with pizza, but it's very late here and I don't want to be hungry. So I picked the boring one. So when you hear acronyms thrown around, IaaS, PaaS, what does that mean? What it means looks like this. So in a traditional on-prem environment, pre-virtualization, on the far left here, you manage everything. Bare metal, network cables, all those sorts of things. When somebody talks about IaaS, they're talking about infrastructure as a service, and it looks like this. We're managing the operating system up. So we're doing Windows patches, we're doing other stuff, we're minding the data on their apps, doing backups, all that sort of thing. But underneath the operating system, odds are we may care about it, we don't manage it. Some other group runs that. And when you're out in the cloud, Microsoft or Amazon or somebody manages that. Platform as a service simplifies that even more. And that's anytime you're going to hear me talk about Azure SQL from this point forward, even though the marketing people would not really agree with me here, when I say Azure SQL, it's platform as a service stuff. I know there's a bit of an effort to rebrand like an IaaS VM in Azure as Azure SQL. In my mind, it's not. So that's where we're managing data and apps, and that's it. So when you provision Azure SQL anything, you're not like RDPing into a server and looking around saying, oh, what's on what drive and all. Like you're connecting to SQL Server presented to you as a service, more or less. And you don't have to worry about any of what goes on underneath that. And then software as a service, we're not going to talk about that here, but it's really here for reference. You're just connecting to a bit of software and consuming that. You're not managing any part of it. So now that we've kind of laid the foundation there, let's talk about what our migration targets could be. There are a lot. This is I would say a speedy crash course. So this is oftentimes the simplest one. And the story where I said it was an actual quote, somebody got $1,000 bonus if they migrated something. This is what I told them to do. It didn't matter what. They just basically had to say, hey, boss, this database is out in Azure now. And that checked the box for their goal, and they got $1,000. SQL Server on IaaS VM, and the way I've kind of structured this part is I'm going from probably what's most familiar, like if you're brand new to cloud stuff sitting here, I'm going from what's going to be more familiar to less as we go through the next few minutes. So this is going to look like a SQL Server you have on-prem now. Probably like it's going to be out in Azure. It'll have a different IP address and all those sorts of things, but connecting to it is going to be very comfortable for you. This is where that lift and shift term oftentimes comes in. Boss comes in and they say, we have 50 SQL servers on-prem right now, and we're moving them all to Azure and we're saving a bunch of money. It's rarely the case. Odds are you're going to want to consolidate a lot of those. You're going to want to look at a PaaS offering, which is what we're going to spend the next several slides going over. And especially like if you have technology like availability groups or something like that, really have a hard think on if lifting and shifting that is the right answer. When we get to some of the Azure SQL service tier stuff here in a few minutes, I'm going to explain to you why, if you're running AGs now, as fond as I am of them, it makes very little sense to not consider the PaaS offerings, because you get all of the benefits and you don't have to manage any of the parts that fall over. So yeah, if we're choosing this as a target, do we choose it for comfort or just to tick a box so we get a bonus, or are there sound technical reasons where we're doing this? I would say there are some edge cases where if you have, a server with lots and lots of horsepower, and I love lots and lots of horsepower, you may need to look at a VM to simulate that in the cloud, because the nature of the workload and the resources you've dedicated, you may not be able to get exactly that in a platform as a service offering and get the level of performance that you need. But those are edge cases at best. So anybody who's going to sit down in front of you and say, well, if you need stuff in the cloud to go fast, it better be on IaaS, I would disagree with that. But there are some times where you do need that, because while the Azure SQL family has expanded quite a bit and they filled a lot of those product gaps, sometimes if you need something blazing fast, you've still got to build it this way. But think long and hard before you land on this. So we've talked about PaaS, we've talked about Azure SQL. Let's talk about what that means. So hopefully there are some folks here who may not know, and hopefully after we've gotten through these next few slides, you've learned some stuff you didn't know. So I'll start by saying where I say single here, Microsoft marketing doesn't like that. It's not called that. In my brain, I understand this best to continue calling it that. So once upon a time, they would call it that, and now they've kind of moved away from that like single branding, though it wasn't really branding. But for me, I think it's especially easier to explain to people brand new to Azure SQL and kind of what that looks like, what this means. So single is a single database. You provision it on a logical server, and it's isolated. It's fully managed, just like any of the past stuff is, and it's isolated from other things. But a lot of us support applications where there's multiple databases underneath that app, right? There's probably a user database and an application database and security and who knows, logging and auditing, who knows what else. But there's a group of databases that kind of need to travel together. Elastic Pool is the way to accomplish that in the cloud. Because again, here you're not provisioning a server saying, well, I'm going to create these 10 databases here and that's where they're all going to live. You have this notion of a logical server, but if you want them all, much like playing in a real pool, like if we're all using the same pool toys and water and all that, that pool is generally, there are sides of it, like you have to jump in it. And so this, I've always kind of liked the naming of this because that's what you're doing. Like there's a pool and it's got all the toys and water and stairs and diving boards and all that. And everybody who needs to be in there can use any of that. And so if that, as these databases need to be together, you still have that notion in Azure SQL, even though you're not doing the initial thing of like, I'm building a machine to house this stuff, but you can still have that where they're part of that group. Managed instance, we'll talk about later. So that's, for me, I would say like these are the kind of the three deployment models of, if we're talking like, well, I want an Azure SQL database something, these are kind of the three models that my head likes, to see them kind of broken out like this. MI really deserves its own set of slides, and will indeed get those here in a few slides. So let's talk about what Azure SQL is, and then poke holes in a couple things that unfortunately I think people are hanging on to knowledge from years ago and saying, well, Azure SQL is not really up to the task because XYZ. So let's talk about what a couple of those are. So it is indeed true that when Azure SQL, and I believe Azure SQL is actually like 10 years old now or thereabouts, but when it was new, and even when it was not so new, the T-SQL support was not equivalent always to what you had on-prem. And I've sat in front of a customer who remembers that from years ago. And so when I say, well, this set of databases for your application needs to be on Azure SQL, they're like, no, because I can't, my DBAs can't do stuff with it. That used to be true, and it isn't really true anymore. So the T-SQL surface area you've got now is pretty much equivalent to what you would have on an on-prem server, with a couple of caveats we'll go over in a second, and then some obvious things like the T-SQL you would execute to create availability groups and do some things like that. You can't do that here. And that's because some of the higher service tiers do that for you. But so that's not supported, but that makes sense because we can't actually run those. But there are two caveats that are significant that we need to understand as we're kind of picking what our migration target should be. Cross database queries are not supported within Azure SQL. And I see this a lot in older apps, but going back to that example from the last slide where we've got a number of databases that probably support the same app, or group of apps. You'll see older code that has the 3 or 4 part, fully qualified name, like I'm querying, server.database.schema.table. You can't do that here. There are some tricky ways to kind of string things together, but long story short, if you have code like that in stored procedures or in inline SQL or whatever, if you go to Azure SQL, you're going to have to change that. There's also no SQL Server agent. There are other ways to automate things, but again, remember, a lot of the driving force behind agent is maintenance jobs. Those are managed for us here. Now, I've supported plenty of apps where it's not just maintenance jobs that agent runs, but that's where we would have to look to like Azure Automation Runbooks or something. And like I said, there are a few options. But if we have 500 agent jobs that run a bunch of stuff, then managed instance is probably where we're going to want to end up, because it supports that, where your normal flavors of Azure SQL database do not. So there are, and usually there's a 75-minute version of this that I give where I'll go through like provisioning a database. It's not the most riveting demo, but it does kind of help understand how the service tiers go together. So if somebody would like to see that, we could do that at the end, but I'd leave it out of the shorter version of this talk, so it is a bit dry. So how do these work? So you've got basic, standard, and GP. Those service tiers separate compute and storage. So suffering on the performance end is not an accurate way to say this, but the performance is going to be less of the higher tiers, which like the bottom bullet says, co-locates all that stuff. Premium and BC cost more. And so you're getting that premium performance, but structurally these look a little different. Now, the SLA of the quote cheap tiers is still 4 nines, which is excellent, and odds are superior to most of the data centers that you've worked in, superior certainly to most of the data centers that I've worked in. And those are still capable of a fair amount. I mean, and it's not a part of this session at all, but I used for some of the AI work I do, we had a thing where it would analyze on a Premier League match day. It would analyze the tweets about all 20 English top flight clubs, and it would load into an Azure SQL database the text of the tweet, the sentiment score of the tweet, all those, who the tweet was from, all those sorts of things. On a normal match day, I was probably storing tens of millions of tweets in a table on an Azure SQL database on basic tier, which is $4.99 US per month, and never had a problem with it. So basic, sounds cheap. It sounds silly. It's capable. Would I use it for production workloads? Not necessarily. But for POCs, unless you're going to be using a lot of size, this stuff's more powerful than you think, and more powerful than they've named it. Another thing to note here is the higher service tiers, BC, Premium, things like that. If you go and read the documentation about what those mean and architecturally what they look like, they are availability groups under the cover, but you're not managing the cluster. You're not managing the networking. It's all taken care of for you. So going back to the example I talked about earlier, let's say you run 24 node AGs on-prem now, and your boss has come in and said, we need to move all 80 of those VMs to the cloud and set up AGs in Azure, and then we're going to save all this money. You won't. You need to look at something like this. And availability groups, building them in Azure is a little more complicated. So if you can avoid that, do. But this is, not only do you see savings, it frees your DBAs up to do the things that most of us like. We get to tune stuff and things like that instead of managing not necessarily clunky architecture, but architecture that requires a lot of care and feeding. So how do we pay for this stuff? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do want to highlight the 2 different purchasing models and kind of make a note where, in my experience, what executives like, where they end up falling here. So DTUs are, they've been around longer. I would say some people would say they're going away. They're not going away. But it's always been a bit complicated to understand, like, what is a DTU? If I'm talking to my boss and say, I'm provisioning a 3000 DTU Azure SQL database. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything to me. It definitely won't mean anything to them. So there's a link to the document here. And then the second link, what is a DTU, is an article written by another MVP, Andy Mallon. He's Boston-ish, USA, and he's AMTWO on Twitter. He wrote, in my opinion, the most helpful article I've ever read about what a DTU is, and it's a deep dive into what performance counters and things like that likely comprise what these are. So if you're looking to provision a database on one of the tiers that uses the DTU based model, and the portal lays it out well, which ones use that, which ones use vCores, definitely read that article, and it's going to help you have a lot more informed conversation as to what that means. vCore, is the newer one, and I'd say a lot of my chats, a lot of executive and management types end up wanting, if you're going the Azure SQL route, they end up wanting one of them that uses the vCore based model because they understand it, and it's similar to the way they've bought SQL Server on-prem for a long time, where you're buying core packs. This kind of makes sense to them. So just kind of a heads up there, depending on who you're having the kind of purchasing conversation with, the higher up the org chart you go, the more likely you are to land on vCore because it's comfortable terminology. So we've kind of talked about, I would say, the most popular tiers, but one of the other kind of things that has hung around Azure SQL's neck for a long time is the 4 terabyte limit you have in a lot of those tiers. Somebody's like, listen, I love to put stuff out in the cloud. I just can't because our main database is 6 terabytes, and that 4 terabyte limit, even though you might be able to creatively kind of skate around that, just it's a hard cap for us, and we just can't go. That gap in the product family has been filled. So Hyperscale is really cool. We'll spend a couple slides here talking about why I think that, and no inside information here or anything like that. It's really just kind of a guess of mine. My suspicion is we're going to see this technology on more of the tiers, because when we get 2 slides in here and we talk about how the storage is laid out and the kind of speed you can crank out of this, and size too, it just makes too much sense for it not to show up at service tiers other than just the one named for it. So this looks and acts just like Azure SQL. Like, if you provision any of these, Hyperscale is not going to act any different to you. The storage technology underneath it, though, is very different from anything we just talked about. Its hard cap is 100 terabytes, not 4. The vast majority of customers I've worked with, they didn't have a database large as this. It's not to say that people don't, but for most people, this is going to be enough space to move what they need to move. The storage, which, like I said, you'll see in 2 slides, it's designed to be resilient anyway. But for true HA for one of these, you need to provision at least 2 compute nodes. Out of the box, it comes with 1. If that compute node has a problem, while the storage will still be there, you're not going to lose anything. You're not going to be able to connect to it, which is a problem. And when I show that chart here in a couple slides, this is going to make more sense. So let's talk about some of the other cool stuff. So you're probably sitting there saying, well, I've got some very large databases on-prem and they're a real pain. Backups take forever, restores take forever. I don't do the restore testing I should do all the time because it's hard to. It takes days. They've gotten around that by backups here are file snapshots stored in Azure Blob Storage. So it's not kind of the native format we all know and love that just chunks through stuff and all that. It nearly instantaneous is pretty accurate. It's not just a marketing thing. I've worked with these, and the first time you see a demo of a backup of something really large taking 10 seconds or something, you think it's smoke and mirrors. It really isn't. And not only that, that IO doesn't impact any of the work you're doing at all. So if you're taking a giant backup on a server now, you're hitting the IO subsystem pretty hard while you're trying to execute other work, probably. This, because it's kind of off to the side, doesn't do that. So backup's quick, restores are really quick, higher overall performance. So you'll get good performance out of any of the service tiers we just talked about, even basic. You'll get better performance out of this because the log throughput is better, as we'll see. The way the data files are laid out, it's following a lot of the best practices we all should be using on-prem, and it's on lightning fast stuff to start with. You can also have read-only nodes here. So going back, let's say for whatever reason, just your architecture needs that read-only replica that an AG gives you. Hyperscale can give you that, and you can rapidly add more of those. What can it not do? So elastic pools are not supported here. This isn't so much a limit, but I always like to call this out. Compute and storage are billed separately. That can trigger some questions from the accounting folks, where it looks like you're double paying for a hyperscale database. It's not well laid out on any sort of bill. You're not. It's separate components of the same thing. But as I've teased it, let's talk about what it looks like. So this comes straight off the docs.microsoft page. And we're not going to spend a lot of time here because most people aren't that interested, but I do want to highlight a couple things. So some parts of this look like normal SQL Server to us, right? Like we see down at the bottom, we've got data files. They're on Azure standard storage. Page servers are new to us here. So, we may or may not know what the buffer pool extension is, but we're seeing, independent kind of boxes handling that. And then we see this notion of a log service and a log cache off to the right. That's kind of new to us. And we see we've got standard storage for long-term log storage. So we still get the point in time restores we may or may not need. But the landing zone for this stuff, as the log traffic comes in, premium storage. It's really fast, really, really cool. We go all the way to the top left and we see how we're talking to this. And that looks like an availability group, right? I've got a primary node. I've got the secondary nodes. We talked about why those are important. If you only have the primary node and it experiences some sort of issue, you're going to have a problem. You're not going to be able to get to all the cool stuff that comes afterwards. But looking at it this way, we see how it's different, but it also it looks like a SQL Server. It just has cooler stuff in it, right? So there's one more service tier that I want to talk about before we wrap up talking about the tools we would use here, and that's serverless. The name is dumb. It's not actually serverless. Of course not, right? But marketing, Amazon has a serverless offering, so by golly, Microsoft does too. So what does it mean? So where we're everything else we've talked about, we're provisioning resources somewhere, right? This, we're kind of laying claim to them without using them. And that's where these config settings come in. So this works on a vCore model. To put this in layman's terms, and this is not a 100% accurate description, but I think when I've done this session or talked about serverless with, you're basically pulling VMs out of a pool. And you're saying, listen, you are, 8 vCores worth of performance to me. You come over, you handle this workload for a period of time. And then when the workload tails off, I hand you back into the pool. So you're not, if you configure your max vCores to be 80, you're not paying for 80 all the time. So serverless lets you handle that usage pattern that you really can't predict well. So you set a min core, and that's probably going to be something low as kind of a cost control thing. Like I can handle my average daily workload with 4 vCores of speed. But then, when the end of the quarter rolls around and we're all hitting the system really hard, I'm going to need 20 vCores. So you set that as the max. What the auto pause delay governs is basically the amount of time as the workload is tailing off. How much time do you give it before you put the machines back in the pool and stop paying for them? And that can be a very short time. It can be a very long time as well. This is billed by the second. So again, to your accounting and finance folks, it's going to look strange. it's not the most responsive in scaling. So one thing to understand about this, and whatever your performance considerations are, you may or may not care about this. There's I would say 60 to 90-second kind of warm up time. As the workload increases, your serverless database is sitting there saying, aha, okay, well, I can't get by on the min cores anymore. I need to go get more V cores out of this pool so I can handle this stuff. It is not sub-second that you get access to that. Like I said, it's a minute-ish. There are interesting community scripts out there that kind of pre-warm those, so you can get it a little faster, but out of the box, it's not going to be instantaneous for you. Last but not least, before we get to tools, managed instance. So I said I would come back to it, and here we are. This is if you want something that looks a lot like on-prem enterprise and you want the bill to go with it, managed instance is where you're going to land. I would say, oddly enough, the number one reason I've seen for people using this is because it's the only Azure SQL offering that allows you to set a custom time zone. Everything I just talked about is UTC and UTC only. But if you're supporting an app that is hard-coded to a particular time zone, which I have certainly seen, managed instance is where you need to be, because you can say you are Eastern time, you are Central, you're British summertime, whatever. All the other Azure SQL stuff is UTC only. But it looks and acts like an enterprise edition thing. When you connect to one of these, which is a little different, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, it looks like an on-prem thing. We've got agent, we have all the stuff we kind of know and maybe love, but it's a platform as a service way to do that. So it patches itself. We get updates, the backups happen. High availability is baked in. There's obviously some considerations you'd have around that. Making sure your data is in different regions if you need it to be that, and uptime is really, really important here. The migration story here has gotten better, which we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. DMS used to be kind of the only game in town here. It's a little clunky. There are better ways to get there now, but there's nothing wrong with using DMS. It's just not always a wonderful experience. And in the longer version of this talk, I would actually walk you through that. It's in the Azure portal. You connect to the source server, you connect to the target server, you can migrate data online or offline, but the UI is not great. And it's basically provisioning a VM to do this for you. And like I said, it works, but it's not the best experience, and it's not super great to automate. So how do we connect to one of these? So there's three options here. This is not just I've spun this up and I can necessarily connect to it from anywhere. So I'll kind of work from bottom to top on this slide. The most common setup I see is there's a jump box that's got Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, something like that on it. That jump box has to be on the same VNet as the managed instance itself. You RDP it into that, you connect to it with the tool of choice, and you're there. I'd say the second most common one I see is you can set up an express route to get site to site, and then so if you need to access it from a different Azure region or from your on-prem network or something like that, pretty common setup here. The least common but most interesting to me is you have basically a secure endpoint that you're connecting to. I most commonly see this when just an app needs it. So you don't have DBAs in there doing basically anything. You just have an app that needs to hit this, and then that's the way I most commonly see that set up. But this isn't just port 1433 hanging out and waiting for folks to do stuff. So before we jump into this last part, are there any questions or comments?
Nothing at this stage, Matt.
Okay. All right. So last but not least, how are we getting there? So we talked about why we're going to do it. We talked about who might help us, who might stand in our way. We talked about kind of all the different targets and what our options are out in Azure. How do we get it there? There's a bunch of different ways. And there's some ways that people don't know about. And the reason I kind of just put this out as a list is there's almost always one on here that surprises somebody. Sometimes it's the first one. So Azure SQL can actually be a replication subscriber. So if you're just trying to get data out into the cloud and then from there do who knows what, this can be a legitimate way to get the data out there. Is it the prettiest? No. Is replication a lot of fun to deal with? Rarely, but it does work. There's a couple gotchas, like you've got to use HTTPS. It requires SSL basically for it to work. If you're interested in that, I have a demo that I used to give years ago that I could kind of walk you through it. It doesn't, especially virtually, doesn't show well, but I can point you to a couple of the gotchas here. But this does work. Along those same lines, if we're just trying to get data out to an Azure VM, replication works, log shipping works. Log shipping for me is kind of one of the most underrated ways to do this. It's pretty easy to set up. Monitoring it is pretty easy. And it's an effective way to get data out into a VM or to a managed instance, which is the last thing we will talk about here. And that's pretty new and very cool. A migration method that, again, in kind of the conference length version of this I show, you can right click on a database in Management Studio and make a DAC pack out of it and migrate it to Azure right there. For a database of any size at all, don't use this, but it does make for kind of an interesting demo because you really can migrate a small database to Azure SQL in a couple minutes with a few clicks. You can bulk load data to an MI. I leave this on here because I've seen it. This is not the way that I would choose to do it. And what the last bullet on the next slide, and so we'll actually start there, is the way that I would choose to do it. So this is relatively recent, but you can log in, and I've got a whole slide on this in about 2 slides. But for me, this is, if we're going to MI, this is the most exciting way to do that. You can log ship to a managed instance. There's kind of a manual mode and an automatic mode. Far and away the easiest way to get data out to one of these. So I definitely recommend that. And in fact, my company will be using MIs for a lot of ours, and we'll be doing it this way. So not only do I just say that, we're actually doing it. Couple other methods here that honestly I see far less frequently, but I've seen them, so I want to mention them. If you have a lot of availability groups, you could stretch that cluster to your Azure network, and you could have a replica out in Azure. And once it's caught up to the rest of the group, you could fail over to it, and then you've migrated and cut over. Again, we've talked about if you're well established with availability groups on-prem, this is certainly an effective way to get it. I've set this up for people. If you're not well established with AGs already, I would avoid this. And last but not least on this slide, Azure Migrate. So I mention this because I would say it seems to be a real marketing interest of Microsoft's, and there are some nice things. If you're doing an enterprise projects, we're not just moving data, we're moving web servers, app servers, all those sorts of things. This kind of makes sense. So it has a migration experience, and like the text says, it's tailored to the individual roles of the server. So to migrate a web server, an app server, database, something like that, it'll kind of walk you through, okay, well, you're trying to do this, so use this tool, and here's how you do it. And it's a bit more of a hand-holding experience, but they're trying to bring all this stuff under one umbrella, even though it's a bunch of individual tools. Because I think a lot of the feedback Microsoft got over the years was that it was just so hard to make heads or tails out of how you migrated stuff, because marketing would call stuff different, names would change. They're trying to bring this all under one roof, as it were. So I said we'd get back to this. So log shipping to managed instance is called the log replay service, LRS. Here's what we have to do to use it. But again, if you're going to managed instance and you have a database of any size at all, this is absolutely what I would use, and it's pretty new, so it's always fun to talk about. You have to have SQL Server 2008 or later. You have to have kind of that full chain of backups, fulls, diffs, logs. Checksum must be enabled as well. You have to have an Azure Blob Storage container somewhere because you're landing those backups there. And then, like I said, it has an automatic or a manual mode. So if you just want to throw the switch and migrate a database, autocomplete mode will do that. And when it's finished, it'll sever that link and you're good. Continuous mode basically gives you the control of when you want to cut over. Once the data's on the MI, whenever you want to cut over, you can do that manually there. So I want to wrap up kind of the techie part of this here with the Data Migration Assistant demo. And this will be hopefully very quick. Yeah, okay. Are there any questions while I get this pulled over onto the right screen? All right, so this will be very quick. So you may say like, well, we haven't really talked about how I know what's going to break if the database goes. Like how can I learn that? How do I know if I can go to something running SQL Server 2019? Or if I go to Azure, can I move it to compatibility level? It's going to default to 150, which is the most recent one. Can I actually use that? So Data Migration Assistant is how you find that out. So I pointed this at kind of an older database that I have that's part of the migration work that I'm doing. And I just kind of want to walk you through it. So you connect to a server, you connect to a database on that server, and you say, run an assessment. And it comes out like this. So it will highlight, you see there's 2 radio buttons here. So we'll look at feature parity first. That's generally the least exciting one. So it'll note, like for this, we happen to have a job step on this one. PowerShell is in the job step, and Azure SQL Managed Instance doesn't specifically support a PowerShell job step. So it's going to call that out. It's going to tell you what the job step is. So it's just kind of helping make sure you don't break anything as you migrate stuff. And then it's going to give you the details of what it says you should do. There's kind of no automatic way to fix it. It's basically saying find all these and change them. Compatibility issues is generally the most exciting thing. And you'll see this is actually compatibility level 100. So I get a tab for each one. So let's say I wanted to move to 130 or 120. It's going to tell me, well, on this version, here's a breaking change. Here's some behavior is going to change. And then it'll show you where it is. It will tell you what it is, and it will recommend ways to work around it. Every database you migrate, you should run this against. It is supremely helpful. And will keep you out of a lot of sticky situations where you've migrated something and broken some sort of functionality because you didn't know it had it. This is going to find almost all of that for you. So I always want to make sure I work that in. And as you can see here, you can actually upload the results of these to Azure Migrate to kind of, lightly automate the process from there. Before we get to takeaways, any other questions? Okay.
No.
Okay, so takeaways. You'll notice we didn't talk about licensing much. We talked about DTUs and vCores, but that's about it. Licensing is no fun to talk about, but I said I'm not going to try to sell you something, and I'm not. But I would recommend a migration project of any size. If you're not engaging consultants, and even if you are, know who your Microsoft resource is, know who your licensing folks are, know who to talk to. There's a lot of different funding buckets flying around to make these projects happen. And they're going to recommend, they might get you in line to get some of that. They're also going to tell you about things like the Azure hybrid benefit mentioned there, which is basically I commit to moving to Azure. They give you a substantial discount on the licenses to do that because Amazon can't do that. So you could run an EC2 VM, you could go to RDS, but Amazon can't give you a discount because they don't write SQL Server. Microsoft does. And so it's really a way that it's something we can take advantage of to make that cost savings real. And I'm not talking about like, well, they take 4% off. Depending on your options and what you choose, it can be 30, 40, 50, 60. It's a real incentive. make sure that everybody knows how to connect to the stuff after you migrate. That seems silly, right? But I can think back to a couple projects where we executed all the hard part well and didn't communicate with all the right teams on, after Sunday morning, you're going to connect to this over here. They didn't get that word, or they didn't get the right word. So make sure you do that. Don't just kind of walk away once things are moved. Understand that your maintenance procedures may have to change as well, depending on what you picked. If you picked a VM, yeah, you're going to be managing backups and all that. If you picked Azure SQL anything, you're not going to be managing a lot of that. So a lot of the maintenance you're doing now would either go away or change quite a bit. You've heard me say it over and over. I'll say it one more time here. Lifting and shifting isn't always the right choice. Make sure you're doing it for good reasons in pursuit of one of those goals and not just because it's comfortable. Understanding the motivation for all of this, you've got to know, because all the technical stuff we just talked about, you're not going to end up in the right place without that. You may have chosen the coolest technical thing for the wrong reason, and maybe the project's not a success or doesn't come in on time because of that. And knowing the organizational politics at play, who everybody works for, who everybody listens to, that's whether you're a consultant, an FTE, a contractor, whatever, you're best positioned for success when you not only have all the technical information we talked about, but you kind of know who works for who and who makes things go. These will be on my GitHub later. So these are just resources I talked about. Ground to Cloud. There's a couple videos I did for Channel 9 there that go deeper into what the service tiers look like and kind of how you spin one of these up and all that. The last one is also automating DMA. So where I just showed you where it's a nice GUI and all of that, you can also script that to run against hundreds of databases and not just one. Here are all the ways to find me. I encourage you to do that. I know I ran a little over on time, but it was nice to have questions there in the middle and a bit of chat. But now I'm done.
Thank you, Matt. And yes, if anybody would like to take themselves off of mute and ask any questions, feel free. I see we have a question being typed. So yeah, feel free. Oh, big thank you. Nicely done, Matt. So yes, if there's any other questions at all, please feel free. As mentioned at the start of the call, PASS Data Community Summit is on in November. The links are in the chat window. Feel free to register, come along, learn from, I believe there's something like 290 odd sessions that you're able to learn from over the course of the 3 days for the summit. If there aren't any further questions, this session has been recorded. I'll stop the recording shortly. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, where you'll be able to come back and rewatch this session at any time that's convenient to you. So with that, once again, a big thank you to Matt for coming along. A big thank you to everybody for being part of this session. And we look forward to seeing you all again next month.
Thank you all so much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Matt.
All right. Yeah, it was fun. And it's almost October 5th here now. So now I know what the future is going to be in 5 minutes. So, all right.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you all. Bye for now.
Bye.
See you, Matt.